In this Baldur's Gate 3 video, I'm going to be showing you my Blazing Battlemage build. This is my first main character endgame build. I'm going to be showing you some level 10 gameplay and like some level 7 gameplay, so not completely at level 12. The idea with this build was to sort of showcase to you that you can use this build much earlier than the end of the game, but it'll carry you through to the end of the game. And it has a very, specific set of equipment that it's going to use that work together in tandem, and I will give recommendations for alternate pieces if you don't have those. But it's very thematic, and I want to show you it real quick. So there are a couple of status effects for this build that we're sort of building around, and these are Arcane Acuity and Heat. Arcane Acuity makes it so that for each stack of Arcane Acuity you have up to a maximum of 7, you have +1 to your spell attack rolls or +1 to the difficulty class of your spells, meaning that your spells are more likely to connect for each stack of this that you have. And at the main, the highest maximum stacks that you can have at 7, you're going to have +7 to your spell attack rolls, or your difficulty class is going to have 7 on top of all the other bonuses you have. So your spells are much more likely to connect. And the next status is Heat, and it took me a really long time to figure out how to use this effectively, but essentially what Heat does is it builds up stacks, not unlike Arcane Acuity, up to a maximum of 7, and the next time that you deal fire damage, it's going to add the amount of heat to that fire damage and consume your stacks of heat if you have the little passive on the right hand side ticked. So you can decide to use it or not to use it depending on what attacks you're doing, and I'm going to show you how to best utilize that in this build. So the general concept with the Blazing Battlemage is that it's a tanky frontlines warrior that can deal decent melee damage, has high survivability thanks to a shield, heavy armor. It can cast spells rather effectively, although it's not going to be as effectively as a pure spellcaster, and it has a focus on fire, which is where the blazing in the name comes from. So when I started putting this build together, I started building around the Blazing Retaliation class action of the Shield of Scorching Reprisal. And what this class action does is it deals 1 to 6 fire damage when an enemy misses you in melee combat. Now, 1 to 6 fire damage is not very much, but as enemies get to attack more and more often, as they gain extra attack, this could turn into 2d6 if they attack you twice per round. And I wanted to figure out how to best maximize this class action. And what I found was that each stack of heat that you have on your character also adds to the damage of this class action. So if you had 7 stacks, which is the maximum you can have, you'd have 7 fire damage retaliated plus 1d6. That's a maximum of 13 damage that you could do if you had max stacks of heat, and a minimum of 7 damage. That's getting better and better. But there's also another way to add damage to this as well. And this is through the Ring of Elemental Infusion, which makes it so that when you deal acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage using a spell or cantrip, that element infuses your weapon until the end of your next turn. You deal an additional 1d4 damage to that element to your first successful weapon attack. Well, for whatever reason, the class action Blazing Retaliation adds this damage to it. So if you have fire damage added here, now you get 1d6 fire damage plus up to 7 stacks of heat plus 1d fire damage if you don't consume that with an attack. So basically what you want to do with this build is you want to stack up your heat, you want to get this buff up and try and keep it up every other round if possible, and then when enemies try and hit you, they can take up to 17 fire damage and attack, and if they attack twice, that's up to 34 fire damage. That's not including the damage that you do with your attacks, that's not including any spells you do, that's just the damage that you can do just by standing there for 4 turns in combat. And what I really like about this class action is that it replenishes on short rest so that you can use this in between each combat. So keep in mind that the Blazing Retaliation only works against missed attacks. So if an enemy hits you, you deal no damage to them. And so we're going to try and make it so enemies miss you. Obviously, you don't want to just sit there and get pummeled to death to retaliate damage. So enemies missing you and then dealing damage is the best case scenario. So you need to stack armor class. So we've done that with a cloak here. We have boots that give us armor class. Our shield obviously gives us armor class. Our fighting style gives us armor class with defense. So we're stacking up these things. And also Blazing Retaliation, once you trigger it, gives you +1 armor class as well. So these are all good ways to boost your armor class. And for chest armor, I really like Adamantine Splint armor, and that's because it's got good armor class. It reduces incoming damage by 2, all incoming damage. And it makes it so attackers can't land critical hits on you. In my experience in this game, the higher armor class you have, it seems like enemies just somehow roll crits more often. I don't know if that's everyone else's experience, but critical hits will slip through your armor no matter what your armor class is. So removing that potential for enemies to slip through your armor, critical hits, really puts you in a position where they have to hit, like, roll a 19 basically to get you in a lot of cases, depending on what difficulty you're on, or 17, 18, 19, somewhere in there. Makes it very hard for them to hit you. And the other aspect of this is the incoming damage is reduced by 2. When you have heat convergence active, which you will with this build, so that enemies take more damage from retaliation, every turn you deal 1 to 4 fire damage to yourself when it's your turn. And that damage, if you take that damage, triggers a concentration saving throw, and since you have Blur being concentrated on with this build to give enemies disadvantage so they miss more often, you don't want to take incoming damage so that you don't have to make concentration saving throws. So reducing your incoming damage by 2 is really big here because fire damage, the average fire damage 1d4 is about 2, so that reduces it. And also your shield gives you fire resistance, so that's going to cut in half the damage you take if it rolls 4, and then you reduce that by 2 is 0. So you almost never have to make a concentration saving throw with this setup. Actually, I don't even think it's possible for you to make one. But if you have a different armor that doesn't have, incoming damage reduced by 2, then you're going to sometimes have to make concentration saving throws. And you usually pass those, but you don't want to have to do them if you don't have to. And something else that I want to mention is that if you take like Elemental Adept Fire, you will deal more fire damage. Like if enemies are resistant to fire damage, your spells will be more effective. The damage you deal with them will go through that better. But it will also apply to the damage done to you, so that fire resistance from your shield will actually be removed, and you'll deal an average of 2 damage. So you really want that damage reduction if you have Elemental Adept, because on average you won't have to make a saving throw each turn, but some turns you will. It'll be more often, if you're using Elemental Adept, but your damage will also be higher if you're using it. Now that brings us to Arcane Acuity, and this is really important for this build because that makes it so that when you're, at max stacks or close to max stacks, your spells are going to deal full damage. So if you throw a fireball, normally when people save against a fireball, they take half damage, right? But they're not going to be able to save hardly ever against fireball when you have max stacks of this, even with like 14 or 16 intelligence on your Eldritch Knight. So this is really huge. You build this up and then you fling your spell, enemies take full damage, and your spells are a lot more effective. You have limited spell slots as a hybrid, build, so you want them to be as potent as possible, and this is one of the ways we do that. And I have the Hat of Fire Acuity here, and this makes it so that whenever you deal fire damage, you gain Arcane Acuity for 2 turns. So if you cast a fire spell, like Fireball, you'll gain 2 turns. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, it doesn't count each enemy hit as 2 turns. It's just that spell in general counts as 2. But if you use something like Scorching Rays, every beam from Scorching Rays will trigger 2 turns of this. So you can use Scorching Rays on turn 1 to build up your stacks of Acuity, and then throw like a Fireball if you use like, Action Surge or something to hit for full damage on the next attack if you want to do something like that. And for my gloves, I'm using Flawed Helldust gloves. Eventually you'll upgrade these to the proper version, the regular non-flawed. But this gives your weapon attacks an additional 1 to 4 fire damage and also improves your saving throws, which is great for concentration checks, just spells in general. And what this makes it happen is that when you do your melee attacks, you're going to build up Arcane Acuity. So you can melee and get Arcane Acuity, or you can cast spells and gain Arcane Acuity. So if you want to conserve spell slots in order to build up Arcane Acuity, you can just attack normally, which is great. And that brings us to our weapon for this build, which is Thermodynamic Axe. And this makes it so that when you deal damage with this weapon, you gain 2 turns of heat. So because you can attack twice, because you have extra attack, you're going to be able to build up 4 stacks of heat with this in 1 turn. Then if you Action Surge on your first turn, you can build up 6 stacks, or 8, up to 7 stacks. You can build up to max stacks if you do 4 attacks, essentially. Or you can build up to 4, and then cast a spell with another, your second action if you want. It gives you flexibility. But this is a great way because in combination with the hat, you're going to build Arcane Acuity and you're going to build heat each time you attack with this weapon. So it's really, really good to have with this build. And something I want to mention is that if you have the Thermo Arcanic gloves instead of the Flawed Helldust gloves or Helldust gloves, whenever you deal fire damage, you're going to gain 2 turns of heat. So this is very similar to the hat, right? So anytime you deal fire damage, you're going to gain Arcane Acuity and heat. Very, very strong. But the problem with it is that because you no longer deal fire damage on your melee attacks, the only way for you to really deal fire damage with this build reliably is to cast fire spells. So you become more of a mage in that sense because you're going to want to cast fire spells to build up your heat and to build up your Arcane Acuity, and you're not really going to use your attack all that often. And I would recommend that if you really prefer the Thermo Arcanic gloves, that you kind of skew your character more towards the wizard side of things. Take less levels in fighter, more levels in wizard, so you have more spell slots and you can fling more spells, taking advantage of this. So those are really the important equipments for the build. I've basically filled out the rest of the build with things that just help spellcasting. Ring of Mental Inhibition just makes it so that if an enemy fails a saving throw, like if you throw a fireball and they all fail it because you have very high difficulty class thanks to Arcane Acuity, they're going to be even more likely to fail their next save to other spells, and that's good for any build. That'll synergize well with your party too if you have other spellcasters in your group. Obviously, the necklace I have makes it so that you add your spellcasting modifier to your cantrip damage, which is good if you use cantrips. Sometimes you won't use them, so, you know, it's not super important, but it can help with damage when you're using cantrips. So you can see the general concept here is that you're going to go into battle, you're going to use Blur, then you're going to use Blazing Retaliation. You're going to, you know, hopefully let enemies come up and hit you, taking some damage early on. The next turn, you're going to be trying to build up your heat and your Arcane Acuity, so that during the enemy's turn, they deal even more damage to themselves when attacking you, and then the following turn, or that turn even, depending on, you know, how much you built on your first turn with Action Surge, you're going to fling like a fireball for tons of damage. And one of the things I'll, you know, mention to you is that if you throw fireball and you have heat convergence ticked on the passive on the right side, that up to 7 damage will apply to every target hit. So you can boost your fireball damage by up to 7 damage if you want. You might want to do that. You might want to tick off heat convergence before you throw it, so that if you don't kill the enemies, they take more damage when they attack and miss you the following turn. And obviously, your biggest nemesis with this build are enemies that don't melee, right? You want enemies to melee you. So if they're ranged or spellcaster, range are less of a priority than spellcaster because they typically miss because your armor class is very high. Keep in mind that you have Blur up, so they have disadvantage, but you also have shield available for a reaction that can boost your armor class by 5. That makes it incredibly hard for them to hit you. So ranged attackers that aren't spellcasters are not as big of a threat as spellcasters, because spellcasters are targeting your ability scores and not your armor class a lot of the time. So you want to definitely try and prioritize spellcasters to take them down if you can. It's not always possible, but you want to try and focus them down if you can. Sometimes, you know, an opportunity brings up a nice fireball scenario and it's just too good to pass up. But generally, you want to try and take out spellcasters first. And one of the reasons that we take fighter before wizard here is because we have proficiency and constitution saving throws. That's going to add our proficiency bonus to our saving throws. And because we have high constitution, you know, by the end of the game, that's going to be +7 to your concentration saving throws. You usually need to throw about a 10. It gives you about a 85% chance or so of passing most concentration checks. And since enemies, you know, that aren't mages can barely ever hit you, you don't have a hard time maintaining concentration on Blur. And your progression after level 1 fighter is really going to depend on how you want to play this character. Obviously, Eldritch Knight, if you're going higher up the fighter side, is very important because that's going to give you more spell slots. It's going to give you access to more spells to cast, and those ones will always be prepared, not taking up valuable, you know, prepared slots from your wizard class. And if you're trying to make this build for Eldritch Knight, I recommend going at least 6 levels of Eldritch Knight. And the reason for that is you gain extra attack at level 5. And at level 6, you basically are like, you know, 2 levels of a regular spellcaster. And that means if you take 1 more level of wizard, you'll have access to level 2 spells the second you do that. But if you're 5 levels and you take 1 level of wizard, you'll have to take another level of wizard to get that. So there are trade-offs there. And I recommend at least 6 levels to get that extra feat. And there are a lot of good feats for this setup. Elemental Adept Fire is good to get through fire resistance. Heavy Armor Master is good to gain some strength and also to reduce damage that you take while you're heavy armored, non-magic damage. You're also going to want some more strength for your melee attacks. You're going to want some intelligence for your spell casting. It's a very feat-hungry build. You could even take Great Weapon Master for, you know, bonus attacks if you kill an enemy or critically hit. So there are a lot of good feats for this build. There is a compelling case to go up to level 7 of Eldritch Knight in order to gain access to a class passive that makes it so that if you throw a cantrip, you can still use a bonus attack the same turn. This doesn't seem that strong, and a lot of people might think that's not great. But with this build, it works really nicely because you might throw like Firebolt at something to gain some stacks of heat and Arcane Acuity, depending on what your gear is. Or maybe an enemy is next to you, and because you have 7 stacks of Arcane Acuity, Shocking Grasp just like can't miss, basically. So you use Shocking Grasp on them to deal a lot of damage with higher maybe attack, you know, hit chance than you'd have if you're going to melee, and then you can use your second or your bonus action to melee with. And so you'd still effectively get 2 attacks like you would if you attacked and then attacked. But Shocking Grasp might give you a different damage type. It might help build up Arcane Acuity. It might, you know, apply a status effect to the enemy, might be more likely to connect. So there are a lot of reasons why that might work well. Shocking Grasp is a good case for it. Or maybe using Fireball as well. And then you could also take this up to level 8 Eldritch Knight in order to gain another feat. Then you'd have 4 feats with this build, which would be really good. There is a case for that. But what I would suggest to you is Probably early on in the game, you want to get to level 6 Eldritch Knight, and then you probably want to start going levels of Wizard. And once you hit, level 1 of Wizard, you're going to be able to use scrolls to memorize spells. You can learn Blur, you can learn Scorching Rays, and then a couple more levels in Wizard, you'll be able to learn like Fireball, you'll be able to learn like Lightning Bolt, stuff like that from scrolls. Make sure you do that so that you can use those spells earlier on in the game. But I think after Eldritch Knight, you're minimally going to want 3 levels of Wizard after that in order to be able to use Fireball and Lightning Bolt, spells like that, because you'll need to be at least that level to learn those scrolls. So that makes it so about level 9 or so, you'll be able to use Fireball more effectively. And before that, you're going to be relying, mostly on like Burning Hands and Scorching Ray for a lot of your like kind of multiple target fire damage. So that wraps up the Blazing Battlemage build. I hope you guys found this interesting. I tried a lot of different things with this equipment to see what worked best. This is what I found worked best. You can use Sorcerer instead of Wizard if you want, although you'll not be able to learn as many spells. So that might be a little bit more difficult. You also can't learn from scrolls, so that kind of slows down your progression in terms of the spells that you can use. You can do this with Cleric, with Light Cleric, but then you don't have Blur, and Blur is really important for this build. So there are a lot of different ways you can set up this build, and this is the one that I found the best. As always, if you guys have further tips on equipment and stuff, please leave them in the comments below, and if you have questions, I will try and answer them.